They had been told all their lives that surrender was worse than death. For years, Nazi radio warned that any German soldier captured by the Allies would vanish into a world of starvation, beatings, and forced labor. The stories were endless: men chained in mines until they collapsed, prisoners whipped by vengeful guards, captives left to rot in cages. And so when divisions of the Afrika Korps and Wehrmacht finally laid down their arms in North Africa, France, and Italy, they expected hell. What greeted them instead was something no propaganda officer could have prepared them for. American trucks, their paint scuffed by desert wind, rolled up with drivers who offered cigarettes instead of blows. The guards looked tired, sunburned, even good-humored. Some prisoners refused to believe it. They waited for the cruelty to appear later, after the cameras were gone, after the voyage across the ocean. The journey itself felt like a dream. Instead of cramped cattle cars, there were trains with windows, ships with bunks, air that didn't reek of filth. Food arrived on trays: white bread, butter, meat, coffee, thick and sweet. Some refused to eat at first, sure it was a trick, but hunger and curiosity won. They ate, they watched, they whispered, why feed an enemy like this? Crossing the Atlantic, they stared over endless water and tried to imagine what waited beyond. America to them was myth, skyscrapers, jazz, and abundance. Now it was the land of their captivity. When the harbor finally appeared, cranes moved like giants over ships stacked with tanks and supplies. The industrial scale stunned them. Even before they set foot on shore, they sensed a difference, a nation at war that still felt wealthy. Convoys rolled inland through landscapes so vast they seemed to swallow the horizon. Wheat fields, gas stations, towns with neon signs, all untouched by bombing. Children waved. No hatred in their eyes, only curiosity. The prisoners whispered again, this cannot be real. Then the trucks slowed. Ahead stood fences, guard towers, barracks in neat rows, prison camps clean, organized and strangely quiet. The Germans braced for humiliation. Orders barked, possessions taken, registration papers stamped. Yet what followed defied expectation. The guards were firm but calm: roll call, medical inspection, assignment to bunks with real mattresses. There was even a mess hall where steam rose from trays of food. That night, behind barbed wire that gleamed under floodlights, the men lay awake. They were prisoners, yes, but unhurt, well-fed and confused. When does the cruelty begin? One whispered. No answer came, only the sound of wind over the plains. Days passed and routine took shape. Morning roll call, breakfast, work details. Instead of forced labor in mines, many were sent to farms or maintenance crews. The pay was token, but the treatment human. Farmers sometimes chatted with them through fences. Local kids waved. The world outside the wire seemed indifferent, not hostile. The shock deepened in the dining halls. Plates arrived piled high: meatloaf, potatoes, beans, milk, even fruit. The smell alone unsettled men who'd marched for weeks on watery soup and black bread. Some muttered that the food must be poisoned, others simply ate in silence. Within days, disbelief turned to reluctant appreciation. Letters home, censored but sincere, described meals better than what their own families had. Many hesitated to mention it, ashamed of their fortune. Clean uniforms arrived next. Sturdy shoes, coats for winter, soap, razors, showers with real hot water. The first time they stepped beneath the spray, men closed their eyes, almost trembling. It felt decadent, undeserved. They remembered propaganda posters showing Allied barbarians. Yet here, the enemy gave them dignity. In every barracks, the same conversation repeated. Why are they treating us this way? What do they want? Some said it was propaganda for after the war. Others believed the Americans were fattening them for harder work. But nothing cruel followed, only more order, more normality. Red Cross parcels arrived, soap, toothpaste, even writing paper. Mail service opened. A few weeks later, letters came back from Germany, the ink smudged but real. For many, it was the first proof that their families still lived. Men who had braced for beatings now wept quietly over envelopes. Discipline remained. Escape attempts brought confinement, not torture. Guards enforced curfews, searched bunks, but seldom shouted. Compared to the iron discipline of their own army, this felt almost gentle. The Americans seemed interested in efficiency, not vengeance. Outside the fences, the seasons turned. The prisoners watched fields ripen, leaves change, snow fall. they noticed something else. Even amid war, America never seemed desperate. Shops were full, farms busy, people smiling. From their labor crews, they glimpsed abundance that made them question everything they'd been told. A nation that could treat enemies so well, how strong must it be? Leisure arrived unexpectedly. Soccer fields inside the wire, volleyball nets, chess boards carved from scrap. On Sundays, some camps allowed church services. Laughter began to echo through compounds that had once been silent. The guards sometimes joined games. It was surreal. Men who had fought across deserts and ruins now kicking a ball under a blue American sky. The biggest astonishment, however, was still to come. It began with a rumor. One evening, word spread through the barracks that something strange would happen after supper. No one knew what. The prisoners gathered in a hall where benches faced a blank wall. A few American guards carried a metal contraption, tripod, reels, cables, lights dimmed. A beam shot across the room. Shadows flickered, then shapes, then motion. A movie. At first they sat in stunned silence. Moving pictures were familiar from Germany, but not like this. The screen filled with cowboys galloping across plains, city skylines glittering at night, comedians tumbling through chaos. No speeches, no slogans, no Hitler, just stories, laughter, color, rhythm. The prisoners looked at one another as if witnessing sorcery. They were enemies, yet the Americans were letting them watch films, real Hollywood films. When the first comedy ended, the room erupted in applause and disbelief. Some men laughed until tears came. Others stared, unable to process it. This was not the world they had been trained to expect. Within days, screenings became regular events. The guards treated them casually, set up the projector, threaded film stood aside. Attendance was voluntary, yet soon no seats were empty. For men who had marched under the swastika, the sight of ordinary people dancing and joking on screen felt revolutionary. These films carried a message without preaching. Freedom could be joyful, creativity unchained. Outside, the war still raged, but inside the camp evenings glowed with flickering light and laughter. The prisoners talked for hours afterward. How could such frivolous people defeat us? One asked. Another answered softly, maybe because they can laugh. The guards noticed the change. The tension of new arrivals faded quicker. Men greeted work assignments with less hostility. The hatred that had seemed unbreakable began to dissolve in the most unlikely way, through entertainment. When newsreels accompanied the movies, the effect deepened. Prisoners saw images of American factories churning out ships and tanks in numbers that defied comprehension. They saw women working machines, crowds at ball games, soldiers marching but also smiling. It was abundance beyond imagination. The realization cut deep. Germany could not win against a country that could produce so much and still find time for laughter. Some resisted the feeling. They told themselves it was manipulation. Yet the difference between propaganda and reality was clear. These films didn't demand belief, they invited it. No slogans, no Heil Hitler, just human stories. For soldiers raised on ideology, it was disarming. Letters home began to hint at it. We are shown strange entertainments, one wrote, that make us forget for a while where we are. Censors allowed such lines to pass, the irony escaped them. Families in bombed cities could not imagine their sons watching Hollywood musicals behind barbed wire. The screenings became the heartbeat of camp life. Work details ended earlier on movie nights. Men hurried through dinner to find seats. Guards fetched extra benches. In the hush before the reels began, one could feel anticipation crackling like electricity. When the projector hummed, the world outside the fence vanished. For 2 hours, prisoners were no longer captives, they were spectators. Night after night, the movie projector became the most anticipated sound in the camp. The clicking rhythm of its reels was a heartbeat of another world, a world where the war did not exist, where men in tuxedos danced across polished floors, where laughter echoed freely. For soldiers who had seen nothing but mud, smoke, and fear, those flickering lights were intoxicating. Comedies arrived first, Charlie Chaplin, the Marx Brothers, Abbott and Costello. Laughter filled rooms that had once echoed with silence. Guards leaned against doorways, smiling at the absurdity of it all. German prisoners roaring with amusement at American slapstick. The laughter was not forced, it was pure, disbelieving release. Then came westerns, vast landscapes, rugged heroes, clear battles between good and evil. The prisoners watched, mesmerized by the open spaces. America seemed endless, free. They compared it to their shattered cities, their regimented lives, and the difference felt almost spiritual. The cowboy, stubborn and independent, became a symbol of something new, the idea that strength could come from individuality, not obedience. Musicals followed, dazzling and strange. Women in sequin dresses, orchestras bursting into song, men who solved problems not with guns but with charm. Some prisoners sat speechless, others grinned, others wiped their eyes. These were not propaganda pieces, they were windows into joy. The contrast to the dark, rigid films of the Reich was overwhelming. The impact was not immediate but steady. Slowly the tone inside the camps changed. Men who had once spoken only of duty and the Führer began to discuss movies instead, favorite actors, clever dialogue, melodies stuck in their heads. They debated what the films meant, whether they were lies or truth, and in the process they began to think critically, to question, to imagine. One guard later recalled, "You could see it happening. They'd walk into that hall as soldiers of Hitler and come out as men again." What the Americans had discovered, intentionally or not, was a new kind of psychological warfare, not the warfare of torture or propaganda, but of imagination. The movies worked where lectures could not. They bypassed ideology and touched something human, something universal. For men who had been taught that freedom led to chaos, Hollywood's freedom looked strangely orderly. For those who believed democracy made nations weak, America's abundance and humor looked like proof of its strength. Every reel that turned in that projector quietly rewrote the worldview of its audience. Newsreels added another shock. The prisoners watched footage of American industry, endless assembly lines of tanks, planes, and trucks. They saw smiling workers, men and women together, factories running day and night. They realized, often in stunned silence, that the Reich could never match this power. Some whispered it aloud, "We cannot win against this." But the movies did more than crush morale. They planted something else: curiosity, admiration, and even envy. The America they saw was not the enemy from propaganda posters. It was a land of people who laughed easily, who lived without fear of uniform or salute. The contrast was painful but liberating. Outside the theater, life continued. The prisoners worked, ate, wrote letters, and waited for the war to end. But the emotional distance between them and the ideology they had once served grew wider with every screening. The guards noticed fewer disciplinary issues, fewer escape attempts. The energy of hatred had been replaced by something else: introspection. Even officers, once defiant, began to soften. Some tried to ban their men from attending the shows, calling them a form of enemy corruption. Yet most officers failed to enforce it, because they too slipped into the halls at night, sitting quietly among their soldiers, faces half-lit by the projector's glow. Letters home began to change in tone. Men wrote of strange entertainments, of evenings filled with music, of thoughts they could not quite name. They were careful with words, censorship loomed, but the message was clear. They were seeing another side of the world, one their leaders had hidden from them. The transformation was subtle but profound. The same men who once chanted slogans now discussed freedom, equality, opportunity. Some felt guilt for even thinking it, others embraced it. The Americans, without firing a shot, had created a generation of prisoners who no longer believed the Reich's myths. Months turned to years. By 1945, many German POWs had spent more time in American camps than they had in the field. The war in Europe neared its end, and rumors spread that they would soon be sent home. For some, the thought brought joy. For others, fear. Home was a place of ruins now, cities bombed flat, families displaced, hunger everywhere. And in their hearts many carried a secret: they would miss this place. When news of Germany's surrender reached the camps, silence fell. Some men wept, others sat motionless, staring into the distance. Their world had ended. The Reich that promised them glory had collapsed in ashes. Yet here in captivity they were alive, fed, and treated with respect by the very people they'd been told were monsters. Repatriation began slowly. Groups of men boarded ships, crossing the same ocean they had once crossed as captives. On deck, they looked back toward the receding American shore. None spoke much, but many thought the same thing. No one at home will believe what we have seen. Back in Germany, their stories sounded like fantasy. A country shattered by bombing could not imagine prisoners living in comfort, let alone watching Hollywood movies. Families listened in disbelief. Some accused returning soldiers of lying or worse, of growing soft in enemy hands. Yet word spread. Across towns and villages, whispers began, "The Americans treated our men well." Historians would later note that these stories became a quiet current in post-war Germany, the beginning of a shift in perception. The Marshall Plan rebuilt cities, but it was these small human stories that rebuilt trust. Former prisoners told their children about nights when they laughed at comedies in American camps. They described the first time they saw freedom not as chaos, but as possibility. For many veterans, those movie nights remain the clearest memory of captivity. Some could still recall the smell of the projector bulb, the hum of the reels, the warmth of shared laughter. They had seen war from every angle, from the thunder of guns to the soft light of a cinema screen. And somehow it was the latter that left the deeper mark. Years later, researchers interviewing former POWs were struck by how often those evenings came up. Men who could barely recall battle dates remembered the movies vividly. Chaplin's clumsy walk, Gene Kelly's dancing, Western heroes riding into sunsets. These images had stayed with them long after the fences disappeared. One veteran summed it up best. "They didn't try to re-educate us," he said. "They just let us see who they were." The effect rippled outward. Many ex-prisoners, when rebuilding their lives, gravitated toward democratic ideals, open discussion, and cultural exchange. Some learned English. Others collected American magazines. The young men who once served Hitler's army quietly became bridges between two worlds that had been sworn enemies. To them, America was no longer a faceless adversary. It was the place where they had laughed in captivity. The place that had shown them humanity when they least deserved it. Decades later, documentaries and historians would revisit these camps, piecing together diaries, letters, and interviews. They confirmed what had once sounded like rumor, that in dozens of POW camps across the United States, captured German soldiers regularly watched Hollywood films. The screenings had been encouraged, not hidden. The idea was simple: to treat prisoners humanely, to maintain morale, and perhaps to expose them to democratic culture. No one could have predicted how powerful that exposure would become. The legacy outlasted the war. Many Quonset huts, mess halls, and makeshift theaters where those screenings took place still stood for decades afterward, later turned into schools or community centers. In some small towns, elderly residents still remembered the time the Germans came, recalling how polite and orderly the prisoners were, how they waved from behind fences, how they cheered at American movies just like anyone else. To understand the scale of this cultural phenomenon is to understand the subtlety of American soft power. It wasn't bombs or speeches that reshaped minds, but laughter, music, and stories projected in the dark. A reminder that empathy and imagination can travel further than fear. The war had shown the worst of humanity, the brutality, the hatred, the mass destruction. But in those prison camps, something else had taken place, a quiet experiment in decency. The Americans had treated their prisoners not as monsters, but as men. And in doing so, they had proven something profound, that even in war, civilization can choose compassion. When asked in old age what he remembered most, one former POW smiled and said, "The night we watched a comedy, and everyone laughed, guards and prisoners together. For 2 hours there was no war." That laughter, carried through time, became its own kind of victory, not of one nation over another, but of humanity over hatred. And that is perhaps the strangest, most beautiful legacy of all, that in the heart of a global war, surrounded by fences and fear, men discovered freedom not through escape, but through the flickering light of a movie screen.